producer Faisal is sick, so I think I'm presenting myself. My name is Heinrich, and my SAC presentation is two directed readings, AU Muse 376 and AU German 402. And both directed readings had to do with history and analyzing sources, and on top of that, for the German one, I had to do some translation. So you will see some of them in my presentation, and yeah, is that all I need to say? We're good?
Oh, you're good.
Good. One part done.
Yeah, I suggest that we close the door.
Yeah, sure.
Just in case that next room gets out of order.
You're kidding. All right. So my title is Music Reception of Gabriel Fauré, Something is Out of Whack. Throughout the ages, classical composers have been recognized for their works and their influence on audiences, and it has affected the way we preserve music today. Even though classical music does not represent the popular music of today, many composers have made it into cultural consciousness, like Mozart, Beethoven, and Wagner. A relatively small number of composers are included in the historical musical canon. According to the American pianist David Duval, even today the music we listen to and perform is limited to certain composers. As he declares in his introduction to his anthology, and some questions his choices, the essential canon of classical music, by contrast, the amount of recorded art music available today is staggering. But most of the people who care for classical music listen to a very small portion of the literature. This restricted standard repertoire is what we hear over and over at recitals, operas, and symphony concerts, peppered occasionally by contemporary work. Musicologists and pedagogues largely agree on a basic musical canon that starts in the Middle Ages and lives beyond the beginning of the 21st century. Only few composers make it into the canon, as they fit a desired narrative and/or are included by virtue of specific characteristics in their music and life. How do we choose who make it in the canon or not? Does the incorporation of one in the canon have to do with their influence during their lifetime? Is it only a popularity contest? Musicologists, especially since the early 1970s, have done research and written many articles with a focus on what can be assumed their favorite composers to the exclusion of others, obviously perpetuating a canon. It seems that Gabriel Fauré is not as pertinent in the musical canon as some of his contemporaries. Yet. Or until I'm done with him. Gabriel Fauré, born in 1845 and died in 1924, is a French composer that was active between the Romantic and modern musical eras. His music did not exactly fit a subgenre like his often compared to colleague Debussy, who was classified as an impressionist. Unlike many of his colleagues, Fauré did not really compose with stereotypical musical characteristics of the Romantic or modern eras. Through my research, I have identified four distinct periods: the classical Romantic from the 1860s to the 1880s, the melancholic yet lively period from around 1880 to the 1890s, his mature, bold, and excessive expression from the 1890s, then finally a return to his classical Romantic roots from the 1900s to his death in 1924. With such variety of styles, one would think of Fauré as a bridge between the Romantic and modern era. According to the Britannica Encyclopedia short entry of only 4 paragraphs, Gabriel Fauré influenced the course of modern French music. Wikipedia offers a more comprehensive portrait of the composer, stating he was one of foremost French composers of his generation. Several scholars, including French musicologist Jean-Michel Nectoux and American composer Aaron Copland, argue that Fauré does not have his proper place in the musical canon, even though he enjoyed popularity during his lifetime in his home country. Copland furthers this point in a eulogic essay. Perhaps no other composer has ever been so generally ignored outside his own country, while at the same time enjoying an unquestionable eminent reputation at home. When looking at primary sources, or lack thereof, and how today's musicologists write about Fauré, one sees the contemporary panegyrics do not line up with Fauré's actual legacy in 2018. The advances in digitalization and archives commitment to make accessible historical newspaper allow researchers to verify claims about Fauré's impact at home and abroad. Perusing the Times, Le Figaro, and a handful of newspapers from German-speaking countries, like Die Berliner Tageblatt and the Hamburg Nachrichten, between the years of 1880 and 1939, I analyze how newspapers in England, France, and Germany have covered Fauré's career and his posthumous impact. England has often focused more on local composers than outsiders. The 19th century saw a resurgence of British composers and a rural British ideals in music. Scholars named the post-Romantic period in England the English Renaissance, as they identified a strong nationalist undercurrent in the arts. It will not surprise anyone to learn that Fauré did not really penetrate the English market. As the very epitome of the British establishment, the most cosmopolitan London newspaper, and certainly as one of the most influential, The Times, has a long history of covering the arts. I was curious to see how often Fauré appeared in the esteemed paper between 1880 and 1939. I only found 58 items, and I stress only, because Fauré was not a stranger to England. He visited often and received the opportunity to perform at Buckingham Palace in 1908. When I break down the results according to my grid of analysis, there are 40 performances, and within the category, I have included performances of his works and performances where he is the performer. Performances also include announcements, news, and reviews. Then there are 4 mentions. These articles only include Fauré's name in regard to the subject at hand. And then finally, the other articles include news, which there are 5, broadcasting programs, also 5, and 1 book announcement, which the title was Gabriel Fauré and the French Musical Renaissance. It is quite interesting to see how London perceived Fauré. I found no mention of him before 1891. On November 11th, 1891, in the last column of page 4, under the small title Popular Concerts, the author states, "Our musical public is so little cognizant of the higher development of French music that much of Mr. Fauré's work must have surprised the bulk of the audience a good deal." According to the same critic, it was the first time Fauré was performed in London. The arts critic commented with admiration on Fauré's quartet in G minor and the genius behind it. The composer is one of the most accomplished of living French musicians. His earnest aim, his complete originality, and his strong feeling for legitimate effect in chamber music are qualities which might have justified the appearance of some of his work in London before this. Still, better late than never, and we may heartily glad that the directors of the popular concerts have been the first to introduce the present quartet to English audiences. Already in 1891, Fauré was earning a reputation in London as one of the most prominent French composers of the time. 3 years later, a critic returned to the 1891 performance and mentioned a second one that took place in the same year. Reviewing Fauré's quartet in C minor, the critic lauded, "A thoroughly interesting, original, and in some passages beautiful work, revealing a mastery of construction that few of his countrymen have surpassed." It was almost surprising to see such compliments about a French work outside of France. At the very least, to this arts critic, Gabriel Fauré was definitely a master and a prominent composer, but unfortunately still little known in England. The critic started his Wolf Musical Unions review with Fauré, devoting 2/3 of the space to the composer before he commented on Mr. Francis Thomé, whom he qualified of less of a stranger to London amateurs. Thomé was also a French composer, and he found fame during his lifetime, but according to music journalist Robert Cummings, he fell into obscurity after his death. Even though Fauré had a long composing career, his rise in popularity outside of France was incredibly late. It was only at the ripe age of 46, which is quite old for a composer, that Fauré started enjoying international fame when he was invited in 1908 to perform at Buckingham Palace. I will readily admit I expected to find more than Fauré's 58 hits, yet taking into consideration the specific English nationalist climate, and perhaps to a lesser extent the fact that the chosen newspaper, The Times, nearly went bankrupt during this time, Fauré's reception in London seems to be significant. Critics enjoyed his music and considered Fauré as one of the most prominent French composers of the time. Perhaps even more than in England, German-speaking countries developed their own strong musical cultures. Starting with Bach and encompassing Schoenberg, Germany and Austria often produced the leading composers of Europe. French composers like Gabriel Fauré had little chance to penetrate the German musical art scene. The European Library database contains digital files of historical newspapers from 18 countries. The project, which ended in 2016, still has their portal open to the public, fortunately for me. I identified a total of 38 results pertinent to the composer Gabriel Fauré. Of those analyzed, all were from Germany. Like the Times, the majority of the journal articles consisted of performance, announcement, or reviews. There were 25. However, mentions of Fauré appear earlier than in London, starting in 1885 with the news of Fauré winning the Chartier Prize, which is also talked about in the Paris Le Figaro on November 1st, 1885. Unlike London, some German articles were more tabloid-like than professional newspapers. A good example of such is from the Neue Hamburger Zeitung on July 4th, 1903. It is interesting to see Fauré under this light, as many articles throughout the ages mainly focus on his directorship at the conservatory and his compositions. Another aspect we do not often see in the music reception of Fauré are negative comments on his music. Germans have earned a bluntness reputation. The frankness of certain newspapers delighted the present researcher, aka me, who found a gem such as a 1925 account of a performance. The songs of Gabriel Fauré, L'Horizon Chimérique, has people bridled. They are neither new nor modern in the sense of the concert giver. His inclusion in the program was probably only a bow to his lifetime as a progressive French musician. The journalist comments how Fauré's works were nice sounding, but it did not really fit the modern concert that was being given. The article goes even further in saying that the audience was flabbergasted by the lack of modernism in his music. However, the journalist still comments that his inclusion within the program is because he was considered modern in French circles. Perhaps this was a subtle attack on the French who could not be as advanced as Germans. All in all, the German articles were not as poetic as the Times or as admiring, but they provide an important insight into the music reception within Germany. My analysis into historical German newspapers show a limited interest in French music and Gabriel Fauré. Finally, contrary to the expression, "no man is prophet in his own country," Fauré gained first and foremost popularity at home in France. Like England and Germany, France had its own nationalist current. Music in Paris fell in danger, especially after the outbreak of the war between France and Germany in 1870. As such, the Société Nationale de Musique, founded by Camille Saint-Saëns, aimed to spread French music and resist the trend of German music, especially Wagner's. The Société helped in promoting Fauré's music, seen in Berliner Tageblatt, February 27, 1895. Fauré was also well known due to his position as student, then professor at the Conservatoire de Paris. The Prize Chartier in 1885 ascended him into the well-known composers. When he got promoted as director in 1905, Fauré was already established as a well-known composer and professor. I certainly anticipated to find more references to Fauré in France. After all, most scholarly sources claim he enjoyed great fame at home. The research yielded 2,819 hits within the time frame. If he did not have substantial impact outside, he clearly had one at home. I did not have the time to read all of the entries. I offer for this section a less qualitative and more quantitative analysis of the data. And there's the graph, okay. The graph illustrates how in 1903 he received more than 100 mentions, 104 to be exact. French musicologist Paul Landormy indicates that Fauré's hearing was failing in 1903, but this does not explain why there would be a sudden jump in the amount of articles mentioning the French composer. When looking at events in Fauré's life, it is around this time that he transitions into his last composition phase, the return to his romantic roots. The highest amount of references come in 1913, with a total of 152. When looking through the hits, I cannot find a definitive reason for the amount of times Le Figaro mentions the composer. Looking through the articles, I think that Fauré simply had a good year in his career. With many performances of instrumental and voice music, news of the conservatory, and news of his travels and performances in other countries seem to culminate into the year of 1913. It is only, however, when looking around the date of Fauré's death, November 4th, 1924, that we see his effect and his reception in France. The day after his death, Le Figaro dedicated the first 2 columns of the front page to Fauré. The journalist's intent show an idea of how French people perceived Fauré. We have often called Fauré the French Schumann. That's not saying enough, and it's saying it without accuracy. The living and trembling melody of the master are not Lieder. The beauty, the grandeur, the new harmonies, the unknown resolution, the sensibility, the new attraction of its harmonizations, the sublime poetry, the high melancholy of these immortal pages make perfect masterpieces. But it is too late, or too early, to analyze here the miraculous realization of this inspiration, at once so superhuman and so simple. By only reading this excerpt, one can see the great influence of Fauré in Paris. He was even considered a master. His techniques, his harmonies, and his compositions clearly left a mark and created the image of a master composer who deserves to be his own legend, and not just the French Schumann. All in all, primary sources show similar results to my theories. Gabriel Fauré was more well known in his own country than outside. The tensions between Germany and France definitively left a mark on the music reception of not only Gabriel Fauré, but all French composers of the time. If there were time and opportunity to do more research, I would be interested in not only looking later in primary sources, but to expand to North America, to New York, Boston, and Toronto. Primary sources show that Fauré was well received in Germany and loved in London and Paris. The next steps would be to study the historical canon more deeply, along with the pedagogical canon and the performance canon. After years of studying on and off the music reception of Gabriel Fauré, I leave with more questions to answer than answered. Okay. Questions? Yes, Andrew.
Yeah. you might have mentioned this already, but just to go back, I'm just curious. What is one way that Fauré's music could be considered original?
So based off the primary sources or my own opinion?
Doesn't matter.
So when looking at the primary sources, they mention how Fauré didn't really follow French customs, especially with the modernism, like with Debussy and with Liszt. But you can also see, like throughout his life, that he didn't really want to be anywhere specifically. And this is my own opinion now, is that he went through so many phases that you can't really put him in a specific box, which is what makes him original. Does that answer your question?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Kathleen?
Yeah. We talked about this a little bit before, but I'm just wondering, scholars identify 3 compositional periods, but you have, in your originality and through your research, identified 4. Do you want to tell us arrived at that?
So, as I said, this has been a project going on and off throughout the years, and through my history courses, I've been looking at Fauré. And when I look at his compositions myself, and I did in vocal literature with Roger Admiral, I found that his later music, and especially in the last part of his life, don't sound as absurd as the third period, and that they definitely have characteristics from the first one. And some scholars like Jean-Michel Nectoux also mention this, but he doesn't want to put it as its own distinct phase. And I was like, screw it, I do what I want, I'm a musicologist too. So, yeah.
So it's the final period that you...
Yeah, like pretty much the last couple of years of his death, when he's retired and his deafness has become more apparent. And I feel like it's almost like he's trying to remember his first periods, like he's almost nostalgic of it, and you can see it in his music. Thank you. Jasana?
What made you choose Fauré? Because there's so many composers that aren't included in the canon that you could have looked at. Why look at him?
So the easy answer to that question is, I like him. Both, so you can do a research project, you need to like the composer. But it's actually Fauré that started me on the quest on finding out who fits in the musical canon. And when I first auditioned to Augustana, one of my pieces was by Gabriel Fauré. And as I went through my degree, I noticed that not many of us really performed Fauré in the vocal studio or in the piano studio. And as we were going through the history courses, I noticed that we didn't really talk about him. And it's like, why? He's cool. So then from there, it brought me to the question, how do they fit in the canon? And then I chose Fauré because, again, I like him. So, yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Mom? Whoops.
Professor.
Professor, sorry. Professor Mom, Dr. Mom.
What do you think you learned from doing this exercise?
I think this has helped me to bring a more interdisciplinary aspect into music. As many of us tend to focus on listening or hearing, my methodology is actually based off a historian, you, and based off research you've done in primary newspapers, I found that it could fit into music, and I found that really interesting. And another thing I learned in this project is you can't always trust newspapers. They are as gossipy as they are today. So, yes. Ardell and then Faisal.
When you did your research with these articles from the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, did you run across the Fauré Requiem? Was it performed? What can you tell me where, how often you would see the Fauré Requiem in all of that time period?
Yeah.
Because that's something that's performed a lot.
Yeah, it was actually quite weird. In London, there was more mentions of the Requiem. I didn't put it in here, but I have a nice little Google Sheets with all the different pieces that were mentioned. Mm-hmm. And within the 58 results of the London Times, the Requiem was mentioned like 5 or 6 times. But in Germany, they more often talked about the operas. I don't really have a theory why. That's something I would look deeper into. And when I have more time, I want to see if they mention the Requiem and the Figaro. But the ones that I did look at in the first couple of years of my methodology, they basically mentioned the melody and the songs. And yeah. Faisal.
Okay. So since most of the other people have taken you back to many centuries ago when even I was not alive, I'll bring you back to this very century. And the work you were doing in my German 201 class, because a large part of that was to actually do 3 presentations, which were really wonderful, on classical music and music. So what was your experience like?
For those presentations?
Yes.
As stressful as this one. I found it was a lot easier to just do a 5-minute presentation.
Yeah.
I didn't need to do a super in-depth, like I've done all this research, like I could have hypothetically done this overnight, right? And I found it was a very good experience to bring back some German in my vocabulary, but also remembering to keep it at a 200 level, because I do have words in my head that like definitely are more 400 level, and that it's like, wait, they don't know what this means. And I'm always a nervous speaker, so it was definitely more experience in front of the classroom. So that's what I learned basically.
And the other was just comment. What I found very insightful for me, because I didn't know anything about Figaro, let alone classical music, are the clips that you also played for the students, and then you got a chance to introduce the clips. So for the students in the class that do not take music, it was an eye-opener. There was a lot of positive feedback from the two students from Norway. They really, really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. If you do want to hear more Fauré, shameless promotion, I am singing some of them in my recital March 21st at 11:30. It's a Thursday. You should all come. All right. Any other questions? Roger, go ahead.
Well, I think like part of the problem with Fauré is in the end he lives quite a long life, and he outlives Debussy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's that, and then also there's so much competition from Wagner.
For sure.
When Fauré's kind of at the peak of his creativity, and Fauré himself, he's also like a famous teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, so just from his, like, not his generation, but like almost like colleagues, and I know it's outside of the scope of what you were intended to do, but do you have any comment or anything that you noticed about like César Franck or Paul Dukas commenting on his music? Because sometimes that can contribute to canonization.
Well, one of my categories when I started doing the research for at least London and Germany is I started to see which composers he was grouped with. And he was actually more often grouped with German composers. And he's actually grouped in some of the German ones with Wagner. And I didn't go far enough to see anything from his students himself writing about him, but me and Dr. Carpenter definitely talked about it in our meetings that maybe we should check the letters and see what they wrote. But when looking at the newspapers, in France he's mostly grouped with the French composers. With César Franck, I noticed him a lot. But in Germany and the Times, he's most often grouped with the Germans, Romantics, which is a research project for another time. So yeah. And Mom, again.
Actually, it's coming as a historian, and there's two things. The first one is that I'm going to try to link them. You mentioned Wikipedia, which they had a long, a much longer entry than Britannica Encyclopedia. Mm-hmm. And I would like you to think about what does that mean that Wikipedia would have such a thing, and then I'm going to bring it back to the newspapers you chose. You chose the Times, and you chose the Figaro, and then all the ones that are in the German countries. Mm-hmm. But why not a newspaper in France, which is much more associated with the arts, like the Figaro is, but not as much as
Comédia.
Yeah, that one. So in a sense, what I'm trying to ask you in a convoluted way is why those newspapers, and what do you make of Wikipedia having this long entry with what you know about Wikipedia itself? What does it mean? And it can be for everyone to answer that too. I mean,
we'll start with the newspapers. So I chose those three because they included news outside of music, and I wanted to see, because I went to go see the hits in Comédia, and it was basically every single time they published, Fauré was mentioned. And that, like, I didn't need to know that. But also, if I was going to further my research, maybe as a master's, I would go check other newspapers, and I would check the musical newspapers like Comedia to see what they say and how many times he appears. And for the times, I chose it because, well, it was the first one that I knew about, but it's also one of the most popular ones from London. As for Wikipedia, I think the English one is shorter than the French one for sure, because I go look in different languages to see what they say. And because Wikipedia is based on any editor that can, there's always going to be subjects that randomly have more information than others. So I'm assuming there's probably an expert or a musicologist that secretly went into Wikipedia and wrote more things down in the English. And that would be my theory about it. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And no more questions? I'm checking the people at the door.
Okay.
If you have more questions, I can answer them after.